So basically, there's a bunch of different kinds of loops, but basically there's two that are very common to just loop through things, okay? Those are while loops and for loops. Now, when I say loop through things, I mean data types. Data types that can be traversed through. You can go through them, access each thing inside the loop, and do something to it, or do something outside of the loop to whatever that is. So, here is the basic syntax for, is this big enough for everybody? Here's the basic syntax for a while loop. You write while, okay? While is a keyword in JavaScript. There's a lot of keywords like let and var and const, while, for. There's a lot of others. But basically those are just like, you can't name variables those words because they're already used to define something else. So you do while, and then you do space, and you open up some parentheses. You guys are familiar with if statements, right? It's the same logic behind an if statement. If whatever goes inside of this parenthesis, you're going to put something that equals true or false. If whatever in there is true, then this code inside this block will run and run and run and run and run until this is no longer true. Does everyone understand the logic behind what I'm saying? I will show you the logic. So let's say outside here, we say let I, or let index, let counter equals 0, okay? So this is just a variable counter, it's equal to 0, cool? So now in here, let's say at the end of the while loop, we want to tell this thing to stop at some, we'll say, well, okay, inside here, the condition inside the while loop that you want to run over and over again until this is false, we'll say counter is less than 5, right? So bear with me. So at the end of the while loop, you would do counter equals counter plus 1, or counter plus equals 1, or counter plus plus. You know that's shorthand, right? You know plus plus is basically counter equals counter plus 1, right? It's just like cleaner to write it this way. So now that we know that we're going to increment the counter over here, we can just console.log counter. Whoops. And then you get 0 through 4 in the console. It's a pretty useful thing, honestly, because basically you have everything inside the while loop is basically just a console.log statement of an outside variable, and then that outside variable is being incremented by 1. So basically JavaScript says, hey, this is a while loop, let me see what's inside of here. Okay, counter. What is counter? Counter is 0. Okay, 0 is less than 5. That's true. Everything inside this code block is now going to run. Console.log is the counter, you get 0. Then counter is now incremented by 1, so counter is 1. You get to the end of the code block, and then it checks this statement again. Once everything inside the block is finished executing, it checks the statement again. Counter, what is counter? Counter is now 1. It's not less, it is less than 5, so we'll do it again. And you get 1. And you'll do it again and again and again until counter is incremented. It was 4, and now it's incremented to 5. 5 is not less than 5. 5 is 5. 5 is equal to 5. So this is false, and then the program stops, and you get 4. Is anybody confused at how this is working?
Does it matter if the console.log is underneath the line 6 instead of on line 5?
Well, we would get a different result in the console. Do you know why? No, it's not outside of, no, exactly. Before your console logging counter, you're actually incrementing. So instead of 0 to 4 over here, we would actually get 1 to 5. But I would recommend always incrementing your the thing that you want to break. You know, like you want this to eventually be incremented enough to break out of the while loop, right? So I would recommend doing that at the bottom, because unless this is necessary in your code, because now you're saying, well, this while loop should break if counter is 5 or higher, right? But in the console, we're getting 5. So like that could cause some confusion somehow. So I would just recommend doing it the other way, you know? So before I started talking about while loops, I said that they can be used to traverse or loop through data types, right? Can anyone think of a data type that we can just go through? Yeah, but we haven't gotten arrays yet. Strings, right? Because each string has an index, right? So let's say I wanted to write a function that gives me every letter B in a string, right? Or count how many letter B's there are in a string. That's easier. So we'll say let's string. Well, no, I won't do that. So let me comment this out. And we'll say, okay, we're going to write a function now. So function will take in a string. And what we're going to do with this string is first we're going to say let results equal an empty string, because we need something to put all the B's we find. Oh no, actually no, we don't need this. We need to count the B's, right? Yeah, so we set the counter equal to 0. The counter is initiated at 0, so we know like when we start there are no B's in the string that's being put in over here, right? So we can say while, and then we could say let I. And I will be our iterator, our index that will keep incrementing every single time, okay? So now we can say while I is less than string.length. And at the end here, I could do I++ already off the bat, so I know I'm not messing anything up. So, does everyone agree at the end of this while loop, I will be incremented every time?
No, because you spell string.
Oh, that's my bad. If I misspell something, just shout it out real quick so we can keep going. So, I is going to be incremented every time, right? And it will be incremented until it is equal to or greater than the length of the string that is being put into the function. So what do we do inside this while loop? We could say, we can write an if statement, right? This is just like any other, block of code. So we could say if string at I is equal to B. Yeah, I'll just leave it lowercase b's for now. If it's equal to B, then counter will be incremented. And at the end, we can return the counter. So here now, if I run this, oh, I never gave this a name, count B's. So if I run count B's, and I pass it into a string AA, B, 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 C, I'll get 3. Do you want me to walk through how this is happening? Awesome. Let's do it. So there's this function, right? And it's called count B's. Okay? Everything inside here is, you guys are familiar with functions or not?
Yeah.
Sort of? Okay. So the first thing we do inside of our function is, so count B's is going to count every B inside of, every lowercase b inside of the string, right? So immediately you guys should be thinking, okay, well, I'm definitely going to have to count it somehow, so I'm going to need a counter variable. So that's why I set the counter variable first and set it equal to 0, because it will always be 0 first. Then we set another variable out here, let I. I is going to be the thing that is going to be used inside of the while loop. The while loop will run every time, and we're going to increment this so we can eventually break out. So we set that equal to 0 because, and it's important that we set it equal to 0 here and not another number. You could set I equal to whatever. You could increment from whatever. But if you guys remember, the first index at a string is going to be 0. So if we set I equal to 1, we would actually be starting at A, at the second A. So if this one was a B, and we set I equal to 1, we would still get 3, but there's 4 things in here. We'd be skipping one, right? So that is not, so when we're dealing with things that have indexes, and indexes are always starting at 0, the incrementer should be at 0, because you want to go through every single thing, right? And let me show you what I mean by going through them. So while I is less than the string.length, the string.length here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? So while I is less than 5, I is 0. So we're going to go through the code because this is true at this time. If string at I is 0. So this means string at 0. String at 0 in this scenario is the letter A, is a string of the character A, lowercase. Is that equal to B? No. So this if statement is skipped. Then you increment I. I is now 1. Is 1 less than the length of that string? 5. Yes. So while it will just keep happening again and again, okay? Until I is greater than the length here. So now that we have I equal to 1, we're going to run this if statement again, right? String at I is 1. String at 1 is a B. So we go into this if block. We go into this if block, and we say, oh, we found 1. Let's increment the counter by 1. Then it will continue running the rest of the code, increment I, which will go to 2. And then it will just keep doing that over and over again until we get to C. So now I is 4, right? I is 4, and string at 4 is over here. The 5th element is at index 4. So string at 4 would be the C. This if block doesn't run. We already counted those 3 B's, so the counter is 3. And then it says it's going to increment I again to 5. Is 5 less than the length of this string? No. It is equal to the length of the string. So the while loop breaks out, and that ends here. So now we can finally reach the ending of the function, which is when you return the counter. And that would be all the B's that happen over here. What's up?
Do we have to use the let keywords before counter and I, or can we just set those as counter equals 0?
You mean just like this?
Yeah, if we don't, will it still work?
Why does that work?
Python.
Why does that work?
So it shouldn't
Huh. No, I can't. I don't know why this is happening. So,
but we should use it.
right, yeah, you need to. So, JavaScript, the let is letting the application know that you're defining a variable, right? So, I don't know why that's happening, but maybe I'm in some weird REPL right now. But without this, if counter doesn't exist anywhere else, it's going to look for the value of counter. And if it doesn't find anything, this is undefined. It's going to be an undefined thing. So, like, I don't know why that's happening. If you do...
It doesn't the equal sign guide it to, I mean, it says counter equals 0, so then.
Huh. But it doesn't exist anywhere else in the application. Maybe JavaScript does this behind the scenes for you. I would never do that though. Like 100% never do that. Because I guess it does. I didn't know this, but I guess JavaScript maybe if it sees something that wasn't defined before and you're setting it equal to something, it'll just like declare the variable for you. But if you're writing code and you're just like writing words with no let in front of it, it's going to appear to other people that you're reassigning something. You know? So like let's say you have code, let's say the counter's out here, right? And I'm going to set that equal to 5, 6, whatever. And now here, the counter's different. The counter, if I set this, if I say, if I just don't do anything over here, right? The counter would be 6, and then it would be incremented by 3, so you would get 9. But here, what you're doing, you wouldn't put a let here. Otherwise, this right here is actually accessing this variable. If you did put a let here, you would be creating a new counter variable, which is possible because you're inside of a function. Does that make sense? Sort of? Like, this variable counter exists outside of this function. That's okay. If I try to do another let counter equal 5, that wouldn't work because you're declaring something that is already declared. You can't have two variables with the same name, you know? You would have to do just counter equals 5. So you reassign the 6 to the 5 out here. Forget about the function for a second. You know what I'm saying? So this is how you would reassign an existing variable. So if you just do something like this randomly in your code, and I'm coming over to look at it, I'm going to be wondering, where does this come from, you know? Yeah.
In the upper example, we use console log counter, and the lower example, we use return counter. Can you explain the difference?
Sure. So let's say, this might be getting a little off topic for what I'm trying to explain, but let's do it. So let's say I'm going to set... So you see here in the right how this function is running down here with a string, and we're returning the counter here, right? And you see the green 3? Now I get undefined. But if I console.log, you get 3 in white, but undefined. This is console log just prints things into the console. It just like shows the person who's coding what this is, you know? It's not taking that value and spitting it back out to the rest of the application. So that's, and when you make a function and you don't return anything, if you don't have like a return statement here, undefined is implicitly returned. So if you don't return anything in a function, it will return undefined, even if you don't want it to. It's just going to do that. So now that I have the return counter here, right, I can set this, let results equal, I can set this equal to this function being invoked, and then I could console.log results, and that will be 3. Because you're saying, okay, we're invoking this function with this string. So when you set an invoked function to a variable, the return value of this will be result. But if you don't return anything, result will be undefined. And this can throw a lot of like bugs in your code if you forget to return something from a function. Cool. Any other questions? Nah? This makes sense, right? What I'm really trying to stress is just the fact of the while loop right now. Like, you write this and you kind of just increment something over and over again. But okay, let me throw something at you. Let's say, so the string's length is 5, right? Back to this stupid function I wrote. The string's length is 5, right? let's say, and then when I is 4, that will be the last thing in the string. And then the next time it will be 5, so it will run. But let's say you set I is less than or equal to string.length, right? Oh, maybe this. Fuck is this? But you see how here? So this application only does something if this program only does something if I find a B, right? But this is silently an error. We're trying to access something in this string that doesn't exist. There is nothing at index 5. So that's undefined.
So undefined is kind of like null. It's like nothing.
Undefined is not null. Undefined and null are two separate things.
Oh,
Null is an actual value. It's a null value. There's nothing there. Undefined is like a bug. Undefined is like this was never defined. This does not exist anywhere. You know? They are both falsy though. So if you're not careful with your if you're not careful with the statement that you're passing your while loop, you could actually be throwing some bugs inside of the code. I mean, in our program, it doesn't really matter because we're just checking if this thing is a B, and undefined is not a B, so it will never be counted or whatever. But as you can see, as we're console logging everything on this line, if we're console logging everything at every character in the string at each index, there is nothing at index 5, so that's undefined. But what happens now, I hope this doesn't break, what happens now if I don't increment? It goes on forever and ever and ever until your computer's memory is exceeded. This is what we call an infinite loop. Why is it infinite now that I'm not incrementing I?
0 is always less than 5.
Exactly. I is always going to be 0. It is always going to be 0 if you don't increment it. So this is always true. Basically saying, well, if I is equal to 0 and do this as long as I is less than strength, this is the same thing as doing this. While true. Yeah, true is always true, you know? So this is never going to change, and this will break your computer. Well, not really, but like, it will break your function. So, what I think best practice is for writing while loops is first get the syntax correct. While, we'll spell it right, while space logic in there. Open up the brackets. Make your counter out here. And then do counter plus plus. Start off like this, and you will never encounter an infinite loop. Make sure that the loop will break eventually, you know? And let's say, okay, so this is this problem. Let's go back up here, and we're console logging the counter at 0, right? And we're doing this, right? Let's say the counter's 5, and while counter is greater than 0, console.log counter. But we're not going to increment counter. Now we could subtract it. So, also, besides going up, you can also go down. It's pretty simple. I just thought I'd show you an example, right? Minus minus is just like plus plus. It's just counter is equal to counter minus 1. Also, maybe someone might be wondering, when I was talking about return statements, why is 1 here? Because that is the only variable on the page, so that is the thing that this entire program is returning. just the counter, and at the end of that, it's going to be 1. Any more questions on while loops? Or anything? Before I move into for loops. While loops are okay. I mean, like, I don't really use them that much because I just use for loops all the time. But there definitely some problems make more sense to use a while loop than a for loop. Definitely. So just be, this is important stuff. Important stuff to know. So, since for loop has the word loop in it, you must realize that we are still going to be incrementing some kind of number, and then we can use that to loop through or iterate through a data structure. It's the same concept of a while loop, except in your code, you don't have to increment an outside variable. Let me show you what I mean. So to write a for loop, first you write for. Okay? Simple enough. And then you open up your parentheses and open up your brackets just like an if statement or a while loop. Now in here, there's 3 parts to a for loop inside the parentheses. This is no longer just one thing. If this is true, do this. This is a 3-part thing. So first, you define a variable. Then you put a semicolon. Then you hit space. Then you do your thing like while I is less than 5 will do, right? And then you separate that by a semicolon. And then you do I++. You can see how this is pretty much the same thing as a for loop, except it all goes inside the parenthesis. So first you initialize a variable of where you want to start, where your incrementer wants to start. So I'm going to start it at 0. Then you say, run this for loop until I is less than 5 is no longer true. So keep doing this until this is this. And at the end of each loop, increment it by that. So if we just console.log you get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Pretty much the same as the first example I showed you with the while loop, except the syntax is different. This is almost a little cleaner to read, in my opinion, because you don't have to look through this and scan the code to find where you're actually incrementing, and you could increment at different points in a while loop. So like the code at the bottom and the code at the top of wherever that is thing, the I++ thing is, will be referencing different i's, different numbers. So here, first thing you do is you set let I equals 0, and then you put a semicolon. Then you say I is less than 5. Then you put a semicolon. I++, and then you close the parentheses. If you forget a semicolon, this won't work. You need your semicolons to separate these 3 things, right? It's just going to throw some nasty errors. So let's say we'll set I to 100, while I is less than 500, I plus equals 100. It's the same thing. These are variables that you are defining. You are defining these rules, what you want to go into your for loop, what you want I to be after each time it runs, how much you want to increment it by, when do you want it to stop. That's all up to you. This doesn't even have to be I, it can be J, it can be whatever. But like, usually people say I, because usually you're using for loops to loop through an iterable data type, like a string or an array, like someone said before. So the I stands for index. So string at index, whatever. So let's write the same function up here using a for loop. Function find A's this time. We'll take a string And then we'll say, we still need the counter though, right? Because we're going to count how many A's there are. Okay? And then we're going to say for space, open paren, space, open curly braces, enter. Here's our for loop basic structure, right? So we do this first so we know we don't get anything wrong. So then we say let I equals 0. Oh. Semicolon. So why am I setting I equal to 0 if I want to find all the A's in a string?
That's what it moves down the digit of the string by having it that's like the while.
Yeah, but why did I do it that way? What happens if I started it at like 2?
Then it wouldn't count the first two.
Yeah, exactly. So you know you're dealing with some kind of data type that has indexes that start at 0. So it makes sense for us in this case to say let I equal to 0. Then we could say let I is less than string dot length. And then we're going to put another semicolon. And then we're going to increment by I by 1 because you don't want to skip any characters in the string, right? So now here we could say if string at I is equal to capital A. We'll do this time. If it's equal to capital A, counter plus plus. Return counter. As you can see, this is pretty much the same function I wrote up top, right? We're doing the same thing. Inside the loop, we're going to say that if statement. If the string of I is triple equals to find A's. If it's triple equal to the capital A, then we're going to increment the counter because we found one, right? So B, B, A, lowercase a, C. So this should still be 3. Because lowercase a and capital A are completely different characters. They're different. They have different values. They have different character codes. Every character has a character code. So they're different. But there are two more keywords that come with for loops that are built into for loops. So let's say instead of find A's, we're going to say log odds. And this, no, we're going to say log odds. Okay. Up to a number. So basically, we're going to throw a number in here, and we're going to start at 0. And every odd number up until that number, we will log in the console. That's what this new thing is going to do. Well, let me write this down here, so you guys will have this later. So let's say function log odds. We'll take in a number. And now we will write our for loop. So for let I said we're going to start at 0, right? So let I is that. I is less than or equal to the number. And I plus plus. Because we want to include that number too. I'm just making up the rules as I go. So we're going to start at 0. We're going to go to that number. And we're going to console log every odd number in the for loop. So we're going to say if I mod 2 is equal to 0, we're going to say continue. And then we're just going to console log outside of that if statement. Does anyone guess what continue does?
It skips.
It skips. Once you're in a for loop and its JavaScript sees the word continue, it will no longer run any more code in that iteration, and it will just increment I and start from the top. So what I'm saying is, does everyone understand what I mod 2 is? Huh?
Divided by 2.
It's not divided by 2.
The remainder.
It is the remainder. Remember that.
Okay.
So you can do divided by 2, but that's just a backslash. The percent sign is the modulo symbol. And that's basically saying, so like let's say this was 2. If 2 divided by 2, what is the remainder of that? It's 0. And any even number divided by 2, even 0, mod 2 is going to be 0. So this is a short way to say, is this number even, basically. You could even like say like this, if it's not equal to 0, and then you'll get all the even numbers, because all the even ones are 0. You know what I'm saying? So this is basically saying, if we find a number that is even, we're going to enter this if block right here. And then it sees continue, forget the rest of the code, we'll go to the next one. Does everyone understand continue? This is not for while loops. This is for loops. Okay. Any questions? There's got to be like one question. All right. So now I will show you a different function using a different keyword in for loops. So in this function, it will say find the first A and log its index. That's what this function is going to do. So this function will be like find first A. And we'll take in a string again, and we'll say, so let's just loop through the string, right? So how do we loop through a string? We say let I, I'm just going to keep using I because that's what I do. Let I, and we're going to say it equal to 0 because we need to start at the first character. Semicolon, I is less than string dot length I plus plus. Right? So this is basically saying we're going to loop through the string. That's what this is saying. For, you're going to say let this I equal to 0. You're going to say while it's not more than the length of that string, or equal to, you're going to increment it each time at the end. And everything inside the for loop will run while all of that is true, while all of that is happening. It makes the variable for you, it increments it at the end of each iteration, and it just checks to see if this is breaking, if this is false, the statement, the middle statement. And it's always in that order. So let's say if string at I is equal to capital A again, we're going to console dot log found it. We're not going to console log A. We need to do found it at index. That's better. I, right? So this is just going to print in the terminal a string founded at index and then whatever I is at that time, right? So, but what should we do if we never find one? At the end, we will just say, at the end of the for loop, if we go through the entire thing, we will just say no A here. Okay? That's not really important, but like you should always take into consideration, oh, what if there's nothing in there? So your function should still do something, right? So break. Oh wait, no, this would still run then. Never mind. Well, okay, I'll comment this out for now. We'll do something about that. So the main point here is this break keyword. What do you guys think break does? It breaks the loop. It does not skip. It just breaks out of it. Okay? So, when you run find first A and pass it A, we will get found it at index 3. And you see it's the fourth element in this index, in this string, so its index is 3. So now, I commented this out because this will still run, because just because you're breaking out of the for loop doesn't mean that this code down here is going to run. But what if, to show you that it breaks, I'll say let found1 equal false, and I'll say let counter equals 0, right? And we'll say at the end of here we'll do counter plus plus each time, and then here we will do found1 equals true. Whoops. And then here we could say if found1 is not equal to true, no A here. You could actually even, instead of doing this statement right here, I can just put an exclamation point in front of it and do that. So, oh, and then I'll console log the counter down here. But then I'll put other A's over here. So, what I wanted to show you over here in this mess that I just did, basically, we're looping through that string, right? We're looping through this ridiculous string down here with 3 lowercase a's, and an uppercase 1, and then 4 other lowercase a's. And we're looking for the index of that uppercase a. So, once we find it, we're going to console log found it at index whatever, and that happens, right? We're going to set found1 equal to true, and then we're going to break out of the for loop. No more iterating, no more nothing. For loop is done, okay? It is done. But before we got into this if statement, we still looped through 3 things. So the counter kept being incremented, right? So, as you can see, the counter at the end of the application is 3. It's not the length of the string. It didn't go through everything in the for loop. It didn't. It just didn't happen because we broke out of it early. And now I set found1 equal to true here, so that if found1 is not true, that's what this exclamation does. We call that a bang. Bang variable. The variable, if this is false, it will inverse it and it will be true. Is that too confusing for me to write it like that? Do you want me to just write it the other way so it's more clear? This is fine? So basically, bang found1, if found1 is false. That's what it's saying. No. Yeah, if found1, no. If found1, I'm confusing myself. Like, if found1 is true, then this will be false. So we are going to not run this. No A is here. But if found1 is false, this will be true. So no A is here, will be console. So like if I change this, no A here, and the counter is 8, because it went through the whole thing. But if I put 1 in here, index do 2. Does anyone have any questions on why that's happening? What's up?
Can you use return in
No, I didn't.
I mean, could you?
Um,
If you want to just return the
right. So, okay.
and like the first one, if you just want to return where the
So instead of console logging something, well, I'll still console log, but here I'll put return null. And here, instead of breaking, I'll return I.
so you can't do it with
But you see, there's two main things that happen here. I mean, you could do it with a break. So if the break happened before this return statement, the return would not run. Right? Because you break out of the loop. Oh, does it run? Oh, I guess that all that code actually does run. Okay. But like, there's no point in putting the break because returning in the application just stops the entire application. And that's the main point. Return, like the break would stop the for loop and continue the rest of the function. The return does not continue anything else. You're returning from the function. So before, I was console logging what the counter was. That is no longer here. Because you're returning here. You're returning I here. You're returning the index. Also, if this wasn't here, that counter would never be consoled either. Because you're returning here. You don't find one. You console log it. Same deal. I return null. Null is here. But since the function is returned, this is not running anymore. In a function, if you return, anything after the function will never run. Unless the return is in an if statement, you know? Because like if this isn't true and this return is here, yeah, the stuff is gonna run until here, you know? But like if this is just like if there's just like a return up here, you're just gonna get hello. Nothing will run. That just stops the function. It gives you the return value. Nothing. There's no other reason to read anything else. Cool? Any other questions? Okay. Now we will get into the slides. So, overview of what we'll talk about in this slide part of the lecture will be loops, while loop, for loop, break and continue keywords. Then we'll talk about debugging, which I didn't show you, but we'll be talking about like how to interpret the stack trace and error message, debugging a failing test, and using the debugger. I'll show you guys all that, don't worry. So a while loop. So a while loop requires three elements. The while keyword, I showed you that, right? A conditional expression that evaluates to a Boolean value, right? While I is less than 5, okay? So while that's true, run this code. And then a block of code. While this is true, execute this code over and over and over. So the block of code will run over and over as long as the conditional expression evaluates to true. So, in this example, you have a count at 3. While the count is greater or equal to 1, you're going to console log count is whatever count is. And then you're going to decrement count. So you get count is 3, count is 2, count is 1. Who's confused by this? Who doesn't understand why this is working? All good? While count is like this, is greater than or equal to 1. Count is 3. While 3 is greater or equal to 1, we will run this code. And in this code, console.log, you're going to console.log, count is count, so at this point is 3, subtract 1, run it again. Is 2 greater or equal to 1, you know? And this time we do include 1 because it's a greater than or equal to sign. If it was just greater than 1, you would just get the first 2. Cool? So basically, if this is false to start with, the code will never run. And this could cause other errors in your application, right? So let's say you write your while loop incorrectly, so it's false from the start, you know? Then something that you're writing down here that relies on an element out here that you needed to change it here, then it could be like, oh, what's going on? If there's no error, it's just like a wrong piece of code, you know? So always make sure to debug something like this, like if this was false by accident, just like check console log something in here and see if it pops up in the terminal at any place. So this line of code will never run because that's false. And then you see in this fake terminal that there's nothing there. So like I showed you before, if this is always true, you will know immediately because the application will essentially break. It runs forever. It is never false, but it will run until it's out of memory, basically, your computer. That didn't happen in REPL because REPL's like a virtual machine. It's somewhere else. It's a server somewhere else. It's not actually running on my computer. Right. So here, the problem with this code is that you're never doing anything to this count, right? So you have to make sure that the conditional is eventually false, or else you will get this infinite loop. This is the most important thing when writing while loops. Make sure your statement will be false eventually. Make sure you do something to your statement to make it false. That's the most important thing. Otherwise, this error will break everything, and you don't want that to happen. Any questions on while loops?
In the console log, when you
Which one? This one or this one?
that one.
Okay.
When you put count is, I thought you might have put plus.
Okay, so console log, let's say you just write console.log open parentheses, right? Let's say you want to log out like 5 different things that are not related to each other. You separate them with commas. So like what you see in this console is actually, it looks like it's just a regular sentence, but it's actually 2 different things. It's this string, count is, and then a variable. And in this particular case, it's 3. So in the console, it looks like plain English. Count is 3, count is 3, count is 3. If you try to console log, well, okay, we'll talk about coercion tomorrow, but like if you did count is like plus 3, it would be count is 3, but it would actually be a string. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but like if you're like trying to console log different things that can't be added together, because then you're actually doing an addition. And that could throw an error, like if you're trying to add like null to undefined or something, you know? So here you're just separating values. Like what are these values as is? And you don't even have to put this count as here. This is just for readability in the terminal. You could just do console log the count and then you'll get a bunch of 3s so you know what count is every time, you know? So if you want to console log multiple things, just separate them by commas. Yeah.
I was trying to flip it so it had count first and then is the count in the string. And then the quotation marks kept showing up in the console. Is there a way to get rid of those, or is that because of just the order?
The quotation marks kept showing up. Did you separate them with a comma?
Or maybe I did something wrong.
Like, oh shit, that was this. Aha, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know how to get. Yeah, no, I don't know. But if you just do plus, like,
Can you do,
it's the same thing. Yeah.
could you do count plus as the count in the place?
Like that?
No, just put the plus, like, put that in the beginning of the parentheses.
Oh, yeah, if you do count plus. Yeah, but see, this is what I'm talking about. Like, this is going to make one string. So, oh, shit, what the hell? This is going to make one string, so then you don't get the quotes, right? But, like, this is saying count plus is 3 is the same thing as this. Which is, like, it's, like, weird. Like, you wouldn't do that, you know? You're getting something else. You're not getting two different things. You're getting one string right now. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Yeah.
So if you were doing plus plus instead of minus minus, where it was counting up, and so it was greater, and it started at
Wait, here?
3. How do you stop? How do you stop the count? Like, what do you say to stop? You don't want it to keep going on forever. And, is it the pluses or?
Wait, let me say this again. So, are you talking about, like, up here?
Instead of counting down, it counts up. It goes, because count is at 3, so it starts at counting, it goes 3, 4, 5. Because if you did count plus plus when you go
Here?
Yeah.
There is no count plus plus here.
But if you did,
If you did?
Yeah, if you did, like at the top, if you did count plus plus instead of count minus minus, where instead
This would be the exact same result, except in here, it would be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And
so
it would still.
How do you prevent that? How do you don't have it only count so many?
Well, then you have to switch this statement here. You can like think about
So
it.
there's nothing after count plus plus that you can say like to count it so many times because you still want to count it if it's greater than 1, but you don't.
Well,
want
then you're
it
trying to do like you're trying to do too many things with one
Okay.
variable. You know what I mean?
All right.
Like, so this count is inside of the state in the parentheses. Is the part of the conditional for the while loop. So that's what that variable should be for. You don't want that to be for anything. You don't want that to count like something in a string, you know? You don't want to, like, when I did that example to count how many bees were in something, you don't want to use this variable for that. This is for solely breaking out of the for loop.
So if you
And
wanted
to
to
iterate
start on
things.
3 and go up, you want it to
You want
be,
this to be greater or equal to like 5.
right. Okay.
You want this number to be there. Or change this to a less, and then it will never run, actually. Because 3 is never going to be that. But then otherwise decrement it to make this true. Or change this. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? General stuff? Anything? What's up?
You saved your record?
Yeah. I'll slide the rebel out to you guys. Don't worry about that. No worries.
Yeah, just a general thing, like, so after the like, when you're either using var or let, right, and you're, like, setting the
Don't use var ever.
the next word where it's, like, count or counter, that could really be anything, right? It's just for your own, like, descriptive.
You mean like the actual word count?
Yeah, like.
Yeah, you can call that anything, but it has to be here where you declare it.
It doesn't have a meaning, like.
No, that's
you're
like for you.
assigning
When you define variables, that's for you. But get into the habit of defining variables that make sense for what they're for or what they're doing. You understand? That's why in all those for loops that I wrote, I put I for index. So you know that when you say string at I, string at index, whatever the index is at that time. This is a counter. So if I'm looking at your code, if I'm trying to help you with a problem, and I see elephant, like, the hell is that? Like, I don't know, like, what's going on. If you're defining 7 things and they're just all nonsense words, I'm not going to know what's going on. So try to keep names to be consistent with what they're doing, you know? But yeah, it doesn't have to be count. It could be whatever you want, you know? Just, it makes sense. Just so it makes sense. Just be sure of that. Are there any other questions? Or are you guys sure? All right. So let's go on to for loops. So again, a for loop requires 3 elements: the for keyword, 3 optional expressions, and a block of code. So those 3 optional expressions are split by semicolons, right? No semicolon at the end, just 2 in here to separate them. So you have the thing you're initializing, the condition, and the final expression. This block of code will run over and over until the condition evaluates to false. So it's pretty much the same logic of a while loop, but like everything is at the top, so you know what's going on. And you can't like increment I halfway through your code and then have the other half use different parts. Have access to a different value of what I is, you know? So this is all like nice and neat at the top. Everything will be uniform. The initialization is run first and only once. It's often used to define a counter variable. Then, before every iteration, the condition is checked to see if it's true. If it is, the for loop will run another iteration. Then, at the end of each iteration, the final expression is run. So, I++ is an expression. So, after this is console log, it will run. But before anything runs, it checks to see if this is true. I is less than or equal to 3. And how does it know what I is? It's because the first thing it does, and it does only once, is that it sets I equal to 1. Cool? Any questions? Yeah.
So if you change the let I equal 1 to 0, is it going to start counting from 0?
Yeah. And if you set I equal to 4, the for loop will never run. So it's kind of like the same logic in a while loop, right? Except it's all happening in the definition. I call this like the for loop, the definition, you know, like what's going on. The condition. Where will it start? How long will it run? What do you do every time? You know? Yeah.
You said that you prefer using the for loop over the while loop. Is there a time where you would use the while loop over for loop? Or is it more like a personal preference?
I think it's more of a personal preference. You could use it. I'm pretty sure. I don't think there's really a difference. Like you can solve any problem using either or. It's just this just like kind of makes more sense to me, you know? Like you have the string up. So like that's the thing. Like if you're looping through an iterable thing like a string, you'll have while I is less than not 3, but it'll be like string dot length, whatever the name of that string is. So you'll know at the top of this what is the thing that you're actually trying to do. Whereas in a while loop, you could do a bunch of different things, you know, and they'll be kind of, well, I guess it's kind of the same thing in a while loop. I don't know. It's just like makes more sense for me to do it this way. By all means, though, use while loops. I just kind of like for loops better. Any other questions? Okay. So you can loop in either direction, like a while loop, how you can decrement. You can. This is the same thing. It looks a little different, but it's the same thing. You can set I equal to 5, while I is greater than or equal to 1, I minus minus. Then you get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know, it's the same thing. But the syntax is very important here. Okay. Even in while loops, if you forget a parenthesis, like the thing is going to break. Syntax is very important. JavaScript looks for a starting parenthesis, looks for the for loop, and then since this, it looks for the for keyword. Since this is a for keyword, it looks for this, and then it looks for this semicolon, then whatever's after, like before that semicolon is that, then that, and then this, and then it looks for that, and that's the thing, you know? Syntax is important. For, parenthesis, 3 things. In between them are semicolons, okay? Otherwise, the program's going to error out. Cool. So yeah, I showed you this. You can increment this by any number, like 100, 300, add 100 every time. So you say let I is equal to 100. Then you set I is less than or equal to 300. Run this for loop while I is less than or equal to 300. But every time, we're going to add 100 to I. I plus equals 100. You can't do I plus plus 100. I plus plus is very specific for just incrementing something by 1. Just by 1. You can't do I plus plus 100. That's wrong. It's I plus equals. And I plus equals, just like the other thing, is shorthand for I equals I plus 100. Okay?
If you just increment it by 1, it would just take forever.
Yeah, it would just take forever. But it would stop. Eventually.
I plus plus 100, would it?
I'm pretty sure that's just going to throw an error. Like,
Or would it do the I plus plus and ignore
well, since the 100 is going to be in the for loop definition, I'm pretty sure it's going to throw. Here, let me just show you. Like, I've never tried to do any of this stuff. You know, I equals 0. I is less than like 50. I plus plus 20. Right. Yeah, it just like sees this 20 after here because it's like a syntax error. But let's say you add it by 1, and then you say counter equals 0, and then you do like counter plus plus 20. Yeah, again, it's gonna see this expression because this is an expression. And it's just going to see a random 20 over here. It's going to be like, what are you doing, you know? Like, what is this? So this is wrong. Cool? I plus plus is just by 1. Plus equals for anything else. So, like I showed you by solving those problems, you can use for loops to iterate through a string. So let letters equals A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You set I equal to 0 because you want to start here. Just keep that in your head, you know? I is less than letters dot length. I plus plus. So at the end, increment I each time by 1 because it's plus plus. And do this until I is no longer less than letters dot length. We're going to pull out the current letter. This is, some people like to do this. You set a variable current letter. And then, let's say this code was huge. You can say current letter everywhere instead of letters at I. And you'll know that current letter is the current letter because that's literally what it says, current letter, in the iteration. So you pull that out and put it into this, and then you just console log current letter. That's what this function is doing. And then that's what you get. Is anyone confused as to looping through strings? It makes sense, right? Like I is a number, it's 0. Indexes are also numbers, and you could access indexes of strings with numbers, right? So you say letters at that number, and you know in the definition of the for loop that it's going to be incremented by 1 every single time. So you will go through every index in the string until there's nothing left to go to in the string. But like I showed you before, if this was less than or equals to letters.length, you would go a space further, and I would be a number that surpasses the indexes of the string. So you will get undefined. That's what happens if you try to access an element, a character in a string that isn't that long. Like if 4 was a string and you tried to access the character at index 6, like that just doesn't exist, so it's undefined. There's nothing there yet. Make sense? Sort of? Cool. I guess. I don't know. No one's saying anything. Okay. The continue keyword will cause the loop to skip to the next iteration. Hey, if this is 3, don't do anything else and continue. But continue. So, you see I is 1, 2, 4, 5. It hits this continue thing, it skips the rest of the code inside of the for loop only, and then it increments I. And then it starts over with I incremented. So, since we're console logging down here after this continue, when I is 3, that will never be logged, because then I will be 4. If you didn't put a continue in a conditional and just put it at the top, then nothing would happen in the for loop, but it would run. It would still run. You don't break out of it. It's still running. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Is it possible to use continue, like say you wanted to skip over like 2, 3, and 4?
Well, yeah, I mean, then you would have to write
Yeah, okay.
if it's 2, 3, and 4. Or the opposite way, like if it's 1 or 5, you know, otherwise continue.
What would the syntax of that look like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, if you guys wanted to, this is what it was, right? What are we doing? If, so we said like if I is equal to 3, continue. Then after, outside of this, we'll console.log. This is I. So we get, oh wait,
I think it's supposed to be braces.
oh, that's my bad. So we get this is 0 through 5, right? But there's no 3. So if you wanted to get skip 3, if you want to skip 2, 3, and 4, that's what you said first, right? So if you want to do that, you could do that in one if statement. You could just do or I is equal to 2 or I is equal to 4. So then you skip 2, 3, 4. Do not do this. I is equal to 3 or 2 or 4. Don't do that because that is just wrong. I don't even know what's going on right now, but there's no error because it's just like it's not how you write what you want to write. I don't even really know what this would do. You wouldn't do this in any situation ever. What it's saying is the or thing is expecting 2 things on either side, right? Oh, so that's that's what's happening, right? Or is saying this will be true, like this if statement will be true regardless if anything in between them is true, if only one thing is true. 2 and 4 are numbers. Numbers that aren't 0 are truthy. So this will always be true, so it will always continue. So something is happening, something is still happening that's logical, and it's not throwing an error. Because this is like this is correct syntax still, you know? But it's not doing what you want it to. So what you want to do is saying I is equal to 2, right? I is equal to 4. Oh, not double. And then you get what you wanted. If you wanted to do it the opposite way, you can say 0, 1, and 5. And you could just say, well, then you don't really need a continue sign. You just get the same thing. But let's say if you like had other code down here, like then you would write continue, so just to skip over it. Get it? You guys get it?
Yeah.
You guys in the back get it? You guys can see this?
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, let's go back to the slides. Yeah, cool. So the continue. Oh, okay. I didn't know this because I don't really use while loops. But the continue keyword also works in while. And it's the same thing. It just does the exact same thing. So like you say the count is equal to 5, and you're saying count is greater than 1. While that's true, we're going to keep iterating. If count mod 2 is equal to 0. What does that mean? What does count mod 2 equals 0 mean? It's even. So that's true, then we're going to subtract count by 1, and we're going to continue. So that means we're going to skip everything down here, right? So if we skip everything down here at the end, the next time we're going to hit here, well, okay, the first time it's 5, right? So this doesn't actually even run. So we're going to console log count is 5, and then we're going to subtract count by 1. So now count is 4, but we only want to log out the odds, right? So we hit this if statement. We still have to decrement here, though. See, that's the thing. In while loops, if you're doing anything that's going to skip the last part of code or something, or you don't want a certain point of code to run, you want to end that iteration there with a continue, you still have to iterate here because this is no longer going to run. If you just skip this, if you don't put this count minus minus here, and I is 4, we're just going to continue. I will always be 4. And that's probably why I don't really use while loops, because you kind of have to worry about that a lot. But they're still like useful, and sometimes they make more sense logically. You'll see when you're working on problems. But continue does literally the same thing. It just skips the end of it and just continues. Everything after the continue sign will not run, and then you will just continue with the next iteration. But you have to be sure to decrement or increment whatever the counter is, so you're still fulfilling the iteration. Okay? Okay. And then the break keyword. So the break keyword breaks out of the loop permanently. So no more loops. So let migrate equal to capital A, while true. So this is saying, oh, while forever, migrate plus equals plus. If migrate.length is equal to 3, break. This is valid. This is fine. You're not like having a counter or anything, but the condition is actually down here. Like the condition for the while loop is true, but we know since we're using break over here, and break is good for while loop. I think I said before that these are only good for for loops, but they're actually good for while loops too. But so the condition for the while loop you might say is true, like, oh, that's not a condition, it's just going to run forever, right? But if you look down here, we're using a break, and we're incrementing migrate by adding things to the string, so that length is going to increase every single time. And if that length is ever 3, we're going to break, and it is, because you know the length starts at 1, A++. Now, let's say if you started at A++ and you incremented it first to get A+++, then the length would be 4, and then you'd get an infinite loop. That's not a good thing. So that's why this isn't really like a smart thing to do, you know? Like, let's say you're writing a function. You're writing a function to do something that other developers might, like you're working on a team of developers and you're writing a function to do something, but other people might come and use your function. This will only work if the inputted string has a length that's less than 3. And that's a problem, you know? This doesn't really account for everything. So that's why conditionals up here would probably be best, I guess. I don't know. But main point here, though, the break keyword breaks out of the loop permanently. Like, you find it, this is no longer running anymore, and then you console log migrate. Cool? Continue, break. They're pretty straightforward. Continue, you're still continuing the loop. You just skip over everything in that one iteration. Break, you're done with the loop. Yeah. Same thing for for loops, like I told you guys. So you're starting off where I is 10, while I is greater or equal to 1, which it is, it's 10, and you're going to decrement I every time. You're going to console log I, but once it's 7, you're going to break out of the loop. And you still get I is 7 up here, because the console log is up here. If the console log was below that, then it would stop at I is 8. Does everyone understand this?
So you could just say while
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out when you use break and when you just set it, set it in your.
So basically, break, like, yeah, okay, yeah. If you wanted to find the 7, you could just set the condition to like stop at 7, right? But let's say you're looping through massive amounts of data and you're looking for a very specific thing. And once you find, you don't know what order it's in, and once you find it, you don't want to continue. You don't want to continue. You don't want to continue looping through millions of things. You just want to break out of the loop. I found it. I'm done. You know, that takes a lot of time. It's all about saving time. Really. But this is just an example to show you how this works, how the break keyword works. Like, yeah, I mean, this is like a nonsense loop. It's not doing it. It's just logging indexes. Like, it's just logging numbers. They're not even indexes. You know, this is why would you do that? Just to show you how the break keyword works. Same thing as all these other examples, really. Does anyone have any questions?
Can you explain the difference between return and break?
Well, here, so let's say this was a function. Well, right now this isn't even a function.
So it's only for functions?
Return is, yeah, it's a keyword in functions. Pretty much. I think you could put it on the, whatever. Basically, like, if this was inside of a function and there was no return keyword, like, yeah, there's a break here and it breaks out of the loop, but there's no return keyword, so that function will implicitly return undefined. You know? If you want to get something out of a function and use it somewhere else, you return something, you know? Break has nothing to do with functions and only has to do with loops. It just stops loops, you know? Like I said before, here we're just console logging something. Console logging is just printing random things in the terminal, taking something and putting it into text in the terminal. It doesn't do anything else for any other part of the application. This is just for you guys. This is just for developers to see like what values are at what point of time. Which is the main point, the main thing you should be doing when you're debugging. If you are trying to write a loop to do something in a function, you're going to want to and you don't know why it's not working. Like there's no like syntax error or anything, and you don't know why it's not working. You're just getting a wrong value. Just put a bunch of console logs in and see what every like element is at every point of the iteration. You know, that's like the best way to debug with loops. But yeah, so console log is just printing things in the terminal. Return is actually in a function taking a value and spitting it back out so that value can be used somewhere else. Okay? Break is just for loops. It's just to stop loops. And continue is just to continue loops, but then not run anything below it. Okay? Oh, shit. All right, so let's talk about debugging real quick. And then we'll take a break, and then I'll slack out pairs and stuff, and we can get started on the workshop. So developers spend way more time debugging code than writing it. That's true. So let's review some good debugging techniques to help you write better code more quickly, yada, yada, yada. So let's start by considering bugs that come from writing invalid JavaScript. The testing page in your browser passes helpful error messages to you if it couldn't run your code as written. Helpful? Maybe. Yeah. The reference error means that the code tried to reference a variable called sum that was never defined. So you can see this reference error here. It says sum is not defined. That means basically that somewhere in your code you had written sum, tried to do something with it, but that sum was never defined. Okay? So this, when you're working in CodePen, this reference error will tell you exactly what the error is that's actually throwing the application like wrong, what's actually breaking it, you know? So also there's this thing called the stack trace, which is this right here. And if you see over here, it says JS11. That means it's coming from line 11. So if you look at back where your code is, where like the numbers of the lines are, this error, this sum, is not defined on line 11. It tried to read it on line 11. It was not defined. It gives you this error. So line gives the location where the error occurred in onlyodds.js. So this is saying it's in onlyodds because it says at onlyodds. Onlyodds is a function. The function was run, so it's at here, and it says the number 11 here. So you just kind of got to read around and like try to figure out like where the error is coming from. Honestly, like there's no like guidebook to errors. You know, you just kind of have to. You'll just get better reading them and finding them out with more experience. But this is the place to do that. This stack trace right here. Okay, it tells you like what the actual error is, what function it's coming from, what line it is, and if you get an unfamiliar error, just honestly Google it. Like copy and paste it and throw it in Google. Because a lot of developing is just really trying to figure it out on your own, you know? There's a lot of self-taught things that like not everybody can explain to you because, you know, computer science is very intricate. So you could be doing something in a very, very particular way that no one's ever even thought of doing it before, or no one's done it that way, or they can't figure it out because you wrote like 3,000 lines of code and they can't find one thing. So Googling is sometimes your best friend. And the line number may not always be accurate, you know? Like sometimes the line number might be referencing the end of a function, but it's happening somewhere inside of your function. So just be wary. So when your test is failing, you'll get an output that compares the value your function returned against expected value. So before, like the reference errors and stuff, that's just really for syntax. If something's not defined or something like that, you know, that is really for syntax. Here, you will say expected 55 to equal 25. So what you wrote is outputting 55, but they're saying that this should be 25. So there's some logic, some weird logic happening inside of your function. And I know like CodePen might be a little weird for you guys to use. So if you have if you're just like annoyed with console logging and the console in CodePen, you could always just copy and paste your code over to REPL and then try and debug it there. Because the terminal's right there next to you, and you could just do like Command Enter if you have a Mac, or just press the run button. And then you could just see it at every time. Call your function like how you want it. That could be your workspace if you don't really like CodePen. Okay?
The error messages be the same from different platforms?
Yeah.
Like that's from CodePen.
Well, okay, no. Like this wouldn't happen. You know? But like the error messages in REPL will be the same in like any terminal. You know? This is kind of nice. This is saying this is supposed to equal that. Plus here, this I think would be the same thing. Except it wouldn't be at localhost. It would be something else, whatever REPL's using, you know? So this reference error should be the same. This specifically for the tests, though, no, that's not going to be the same in REPL. But you can write your own tests, right? Like if you're trying to count all the A's in a string and you put in something with like 6 A's, you could say console log the result of this string should triple equal 6. And then you could just write your own test that way. If you want to. This is just like, you know, if you want to do that, whatever. So note that there's debugging failed test. It's plain English, so you know what the test is looking for, and you know that your function is putting this thing out, right? Usually, let's say instead of 55, that's undefined. A great place to start would be to check if you're returning something from your function. Because, like I said, if you don't actually write return this value at the end of the function, undefined will be returned. So it's going to say, maybe you did all of your logic correctly and the results string is exactly what you want it to be, but you don't return it, so you get undefined to equal whatever, you know? So that's a great place to start. That's just a tip, in my opinion. Oh, would you look at this? If your test is failing with undefined outputs, make sure you are returning values from your functions, not console.logging them. Okay. That's just a great place to start. Oh, they have this little example right here too. It can also help to look directly at the code that defines how the test is supposed to work. Look for a test in the star.spec.js file with the same plain language. I think this is just like at the bottom of the CodePen. If you guys are at CodePen, it's just like anything that starts with describe and then it and stuff like that. Those are all tests. Don't touch those really, but you can read through them to see what they are actually doing. You know. So, like, for example, ignore this. Can you guys see this really? No, right? How about now? You guys good? With this black right here? Maybe one more? Ooh, okay. So, ignore this long string, like, returns the sum of all odd nums between the provided argument and 0. That's basically telling you what the test is supposed to be doing. But what's happening here is they're defining return value to be the results of the return value of only odds invoked with 10. They are calling the function you wrote only odds and passing 10 into it. And they're saying that the return value should be equal to 25. They expect that return value to equal 25. The tests are actually written more closely to English than like what you will be writing, you know? Like this is, everyone understands this sentence, right? Expect this to equal 25, right? So if you like kind of look through the tests and then you look for where they're calling your functions and stuff, you should see exactly what they're doing before that, if they're doing something else before that, and I don't know, just how they're using your functions. So reading tests could help you out too. Yeah, like you can see like what they're actually passing in, like 10, you know, and 10 might be a number that you never thought of, might be passed into your function. It could break everything, you know. And there's this thing called debugger. I don't really know if this is in other browsers, but there's definitely like the Chrome debugger. So basically, if you put this word debugger inside of your function when it's being called in CodePen. Actually, I don't really know if CodePen will let, but basically, like if you do Command Option J, or if you just do, you get like this, right? This is like the Chrome DevTools. Or if you just do like right-click, inspect, you got the DevTools of the page, and you have your console here. So if you have that open and you're running a function with the debugger keyword, debugger thing will pop up. I will show you how to do that in VS Code. Just give me a second. So invoking the, actually, I'll show you, one second. There's definitely a way. It kind of doesn't really always work in REPL. I just want you to be aware of like what it is. No, not this one. 1 second. Right. So here we have a function that, for some reason, I can't really get this to work in REPL sometimes, but this works. The function log characters, then it has this debugger keyword, right? So this is basically looping through something and then console logging everything here. So if you just like run this code, it will just say for loop, right? But if you open up these dev tools, and this is open now, and then you run, Chrome does this for you. It's paused in debugger. I don't know if I can make this like readably bigger for you. Oh yeah, I can. Dope. So it's paused in debugger, and then you use this button to step over next function. No, I think it's use this. You kind of like play around with it, and then it'll tell you. Oh, I did something wrong. But like I think you click this button, and then it goes through every line of code in the iteration, and it tells you what the value of every variable is. So this is a way to debug if you want to. You can also just console log. I mean, whatever you guys want to do. But debugger exists, and it is very, very, very useful for. Oh, just don't look at this. It's very, very useful for huge functions and huge code, like functions that call other functions and do a million things. Debugger is very, very useful. But like for something like small like this, you don't really need the debugger, in my opinion. But just know that it's there, and you literally just do this and make sure your console's open. And you open the console like this, inspect, and go to the DevTools or whatever. Or if you have a Mac, it's Command Option J. I don't really know what I don't know what the shortcut is for a Windows computer. Yeah, so open Chrome DevTools, right-click, inspect console, run your code in CodePen. Your code will pause when it hits the debugger keyword, and note the scope panel on the right side of the screen. This continuously updates the values assigned. Select the arrow button to move your code forward one line. It's sometimes easier to use debugger when you call the function directly through the console instead of letting test call your code. You know, this is like, I think you guys have access to the slides. If you want to play around with the debugger, you could look at this again to see what's going on. Maybe if you want to, if you have free time, like write a simple function and then play around with the debugger to see what's actually going on. So there's also in VS Code, let me see 1 second. Yeah, so I don't know if you guys use VS Code, but like, so I have this function, right? So if it's just like debugger, it's console logging I in a for loop, and then I'm calling it over here. The main thing is that to use these debuggers, you have to call the function, right? And now in CodePen, the tests are calling your functions. So if you actually want to use debugger, you might want to comment out all of the tests and call it with your own values, because the tests might be calling it with something weird, and they're also calling like a bunch of functions at once, so like you never really know what's going on. So yeah, that might be useful. But like here, it's like, okay, I wrote this function, I'm calling it. Then you click this button over here. You click this button over here to open up this side view. And then you just go to the top of the screen and you click this play. And now we're paused in debugger. It ran the func. This is pretty much the same thing in the DevTools, right? It ran this function because it looked at this line and then it saw, oh, I'm invoking this, I'm going to run this function. It sees debuggers, so now it's paused. And now we're going to step into this for loop. Yeah, it's this button. It's the button, not the straight, not the down. You know. And now over here, don't worry about this. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about this weird thing. But like, what's this? I, it says, is undefined. But then, because you see that it was here, but now it's over here, so it ran through this expression. So now I is 0. Do you see? Every step, I is going to, something weird is going to happen with I. So I is still 0, you console log I, and now we're on console log, and you click next again, we're back at the top in the for loop, and now I is now 1. And just using context clues, I think this is just the number of times you're going through, like you're clicking the button, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. So like, if you had other variables in here, it would show you, they would pop up over here in the block. And then there's local, and then global. Oh, jeez. You don't have to worry about that right now. But yeah, so like if you had other variables over here, it would highlight them, and they would change over here, so you would know at each point in time, after this line runs, what are these variables going to be. Okay? And then you could just stop it like that. and close it. If you're using VS, this is just for VS Code. Like, you don't have to worry about this if you're not using VS Code. But yeah, and then you could read over this in your free time if you want to try it out. You know, whatever. So, recap, we talked about while loops, for loops, and then the break and continue keywords, and then I told you guys some tips on debugging. Are there any questions before you guys take a break? That was kind of long. My apologies. Any questions? All right. Take a 5-minute break. I'll slide out pairs at like at 8:30. Okay, and then we'll start the workshop.